But the downside to writing a book really comes from the fact that you spend an awful lot of time sitting by yourself, not moving a lot. So you're alone and you're kind of motionless while you're doing all of this wonderful thinking. So when I got to the end of writing my book, I decided it might be a good idea to take a spoonful of my own medicine, so to speak. And I wanted to try and find an activity that was the opposite to what I had been doing, which was sitting alone or by myself, not moving a lot. And as luck would have it, my local primary school, AmDram, amateur theatre group, was holding auditions. And I thought, well, that's kind of the opposite of sitting by myself, not moving much. So I went along to the auditions and sort of said to everyone, hey, look, I can't sing, I can't dance, but I want to be involved. And I was very lucky enough to be given the job of opening and closing the curtains. But I was also allowed to dance in the very back row of the ensemble. So I was thrilled with this opportunity, and I went along to the first rehearsal and walked our new dance teacher. And I was like, oh, that snobby woman. And it turned out that I had actually met, or kind of met, my new dance teacher before. So about 5 years earlier, I had been taking my youngest son. I have two boys who are 11 and 13, and I've been taking my youngest son to music lessons. And I spent a year and a half in a room where him and a bunch of other kids learned to play piano. And I'd sat across from this woman. And over the year and a half, I decided, well, she was a bit of a snobby cow because she didn't speak, didn't look very nice. And it turns out actually I was completely wrong about her. She's incredibly warm and friendly and completely awesome, and we're into lots of the same things. And as the rehearsals went along, I kind of went over to her and I said, you know, I used to think that you were a very snobby cow. And she went, oh, that's funny, because I used to think that you were very, judgmental and dismissive. And it turns out that we both suffer from what may be colloquially known as resting bitch face syndrome, whereby our neutral face can look kind of snobby or judgmental or dismissive. And it didn't really represent what was underneath, which was that we were two people who were really craving connection and who deeply value conversation and friendship. But it shouldn't be as a surprise to me, because us humans are notoriously bad at making a guess about the emotional state of strangers. We're quite good at figuring out what the people we know well, our children or our partners or our parents perhaps, what they're thinking or feeling. But for strangers, we're actually not that good at it. And that's because often our facial expressions and our body movements don't necessarily match our emotional state on the inside. But we've really been led to believe that faces and our expressions kind of match what is on the inside. And if you've ever watched TV, perhaps you might have been led to believe this. Now, Malcolm Gladwell talks about this idea at great length in his most recent book, Talking to Strangers. I'm sort of stealing from Malcolm Gladwell now, but he uses the fantastic episode of the TV show Friends. And he recommends you try and watch an episode or two with the sound off, because it turns out that, believe it or not, episodes of Friends, and the whole series really, actually have quite a complex plot with a lot of backstories and relationships to understand. But not one person ever has sort of got to the end of an episode of Friends and went, oh, well, I didn't really understand what went on then. We all know exactly what happens. And that's because the actors, because they're actors, their facial expressions and their body movements are very good matches to their feelings inside their bodies. So here's some examples. So here's Joey. Joey is surprised. He's got like this classic surprise face. And here is Ross. Ross looks perplexed, because Ross is always perplexed. In fact, if you look up a perplexed emoji on your phone, it'll look like Ross. And here is Rachel and Chandler, who are kind of looking perhaps slightly shocked or disgusted, and they're showing very stereotypical expressions on their faces and their body movements as they draw away in disgust. And TV shows like Friends, and just the kind of the chat that we hear about every day, kind of has led us to believe that emotions are really super simple, they're very basic, and they're very obvious to detect in other people. But they're not. There's even psychological research supporting this idea that what you see on someone's face is a match. And if you pick up a lot of psychology textbooks, you'll come across the work by Paul Ekman, who classified these 6 so-called universal emotions or facial expressions which correspond exactly to distinct emotions, and claimed that no matter where you go in the world, these emotions will be displayed. And the implication really from that is that all humans everywhere are born with this repository of 6 or so hardwired emotions that are present in our brains from birth. And if you're slightly more experienced with some of these ideas, you might have come across this idea that most of our feelings are kind of hardwired into this little primitive reptilian core, this reptilian brain, which is hidden deep inside and overrides any kind of rational thought and is responsible for your fight or flight responses. Now, this is one of my least favorite topics within Europe. Well, it's actually one of my favourite topics to rant and rave about. I'm not going to rant and rave about it too much now. I will put a link in the chat that you can go away and follow up later on, perhaps, if you want to learn a little bit more about why I don't like this idea. But suffice to say, it's completely unsupported by neuroscience or evolutionary biology, because it turns out we're not born with 5 or 6 or 7 emotions that are hardwired into our brain so that we're kind of a bit like Joey or a bit like Ross, and that's kind of all we've got to go on. Emotions, you know, they're not hardwired before birth. A baby is not born with hardwired emotions. We learn to construct emotions in our brains in the same way that we learn behaviours and thoughts form as part of our memories and our experiences. And we learn the appropriate responses to a situation. So a little baby's brain is born with it's like a rough genetic graft to put it into place. And then it requires wiring instructions to build a mind. So when we learn something new, we have an experience, that's kind of like a wiring instruction that modifies the brain. And these little brains prune and tune themselves to the outside world. And that world is really created by adults for the interactions we have. But of course, remembering that we also, when small children are young and babies, you know, newborn babies, we're regulating their physiology for them too. We're making sure they're not wet and cold and hungry, and we're soothing them when they get stressed. So there's a lot of wiring instructions going into a baby's brain. And as babies get a little bit older, we're starting to use language, we're starting to use words, and this is another wiring instruction. Words are another data input that are mixed up with the signals from the body and the outside world to help construct these so-called emotions or thoughts or experiences or behaviours. So it might feel like emotions are hardwired and we have a repository of them, but we learn to construct them as we go through normal development. Now, there is a very good neuroscientific reason supporting this idea that emotions are not hardwired. And it's this idea here that your brain is a prediction machine. So bear with me, because when I first heard this phrase, your brain is a prediction machine, I was like, I don't really want to know about that. So when I was doing my PhD, I worked very, very closely with a couple of very, very clever computational neuroscientists. And essentially they were using all of these algorithms and mathematical modeling and data crunching to come up with predictions about what the brain would do. And I never really understood what they were doing, and I couldn't quite keep up with them. So when I heard this phrase, your brain is a prediction machine, I was really worried I wouldn't understand it. So I tried to avoid it for a very long time. So, you know, go figure my growth mindset there. But anyway, it's actually quite a simple concept. And I'll give you a couple of kind of analogies or stories that'll help you understand it a little bit more. But here's what it means. Your brain is constantly trying to figure out what to tell your body to do next. So your brain is sitting inside your skull and it's receiving, you know, the skull is kind of dark and silent. The brain doesn't really kind of know what's happening outside. All it can do is make sense of all of the data that's streaming into it, whether it be from the outside world through our senses or signals from our body. And essentially that data is really just like light waves and sound waves and streams of hormonal information or body pH or blood carbon dioxide levels. I mean, it's not, when it comes down to it, that interesting, but the brain is able to figure out what all of that data means and come up with a concept which enables the brain to tell the body what to do next. So think about this idea, your brain's kind of guessing the future. And one way that I like to think about this is to imagine you're riding your bike along a really, really busy street. And you aren't looking at trying to figure out where to go next by looking at where the wheel is touching the ground, like immediately in front of you on that spot. You're always looking 10, 20, 50 meters in front of you. And you're constantly calculating the trajectory of cars, what the traffic lights are doing. You might see people who are about to cross the road and you'll make a guess at how they might behave. A toddler might behave very differently than an adult. You're perhaps thinking there's a bump in the road or there's a hill coming. So you're constantly guessing about what is going to happen next based on the data that's coming in, so you can kind of get ready to figure out what to do. You're not looking directly on the ground in front of you, you're always looking ahead. So you are making predictions on how to behave in the future. And essentially that's what our brain is doing all of the time. So I like to teach this next model that I'm going to teach you is like a framework, which is a really useful way to kind of think about how the brain works and where all of this information comes from and kind of what to do with that information. The brain's receiving a constant stream of information. I call it from our bottom up. Well, it's bottom up, outside in, top down. So bottom up, there's a constant flow of information coming into your brain from your body with signals about hormones and your immune system and, you know, your heart, and message about the food you've eaten and signals from your gut and your muscles, etc. There's constant input about your physiological state coming into your brain, and then your brain is figuring out what that means and then is sending messages back down to your body. So there's a constant communication and conversation going on between your body and your brain. Now, the brain isn't just getting data from your bottom-up body, it's also getting it from the outside-in world. So perhaps this is the people that you're interacting with, perhaps it's nature that you can see out the window or your immediate built environment, perhaps it's the light-dark cycles. You know, we live on a planet that spins on its axis as it goes around the sun, and every cell in our body has this circadian light-dark rhythm that's been entrained by the outside-in world. And of course, there's other things that happen out there that can get in under our, you know, get in through our senses. Like, I mean, just think about the news. That's out there and it's coming in. And then finally, we have top down. So these are our experiences or our memories or our expectations or our beliefs. And so at any moment in time, the brain is receiving information from your bottom-up body, the outside-in world, and you're top down, and it's kind of going, oh, so last time I was in a similar situation, when my body was in a similar physiological state, then what did I do? So what should I do next? Now, I just want to take a bit of an aside here from talking about the brain being a prediction machine and just saying, if you don't take anything else away, hopefully there'll be lots of takeaways from this, but this is a really useful framework for thinking about lots of neuroscience problems. I'm asked so many questions all of the time about the brain. I might be asked, for example, what might be a cause of depression? And I go, hey, let's take a bottom-up, outside and top-down approach. Let's look at perhaps what's going on in someone's body. Perhaps they've got a genetic predisposition to depression, perhaps they're eating terrible food, or perhaps they're not moving their bodies through the world, or perhaps there's something outside in at play. Perhaps there's complete social disconnection, or there's an incredibly stressful event, or perhaps it's some top-down expectation or rumination, or perhaps it's a combination of the three which have coalesced to perhaps produce a depressed state. Or we could throw something else in, like what are the risk factors for Alzheimer's from the bottom up, outside in, or top down? Or how might we treat insomnia from the bottom up, the outside in, and the top down? So this is a really useful framework for approaching a lot of neuroscience problems or questions that that you may have, and is quite useful to go away and explain, you know, to other people if you want to explain the brain or share some findings with them. So if we get back to the idea of emotions, because we're here today to talk about emotional granularity, let's take another kind of analogy, because they're always really useful and good takeaways for you to go and share, perhaps with kids you work with or your families or other people. So if we think about how the brain creates an emotion, I like to use an analogy like Master Chef kitchen. I don't know whether everyone here is in Australia, but looking through the chat, it looked like everyone was in Australia. So I think about the being a chef in the Master Chef kitchen, and let's use emotions as the analogy. Is the little dessert that you're making, and the Master Chef, you know, they walk into the Master Chef kitchen and perhaps they're given a mystery box of ingredients, and perhaps there's just some basics as well, like some eggs and some butter and some flour and some salt and some sugar. And you could mix them up in lots of different ways and create quite a range of different desserts or baked goods. But each person is going to come up with something different based on those ingredients, and perhaps if they have access to the MasterChef pantry, or perhaps their interpretation of the judge's instructions. And all of that will somehow be combined with their previous knowledge or experience of recipes or experience of working in a kitchen. And they may also draw on their cultural or family background. So we've got a lot of ingredients. Instead of thinking about data inputs or streams of information, we can think about emotions as being created by lots of different ingredients. And everyone's going to mix ingredients up in different ways and put them together. So, you know, maybe we'll get Reynolds Golden Snitch dessert egg, or Poe's macarons, or Callum's chocolate mousse. They've got a range of different ingredients, but they mix them up in different ways to create a new little dessert for the judges to take a look at. Look, all analogies kind of come to a natural end, and I think we might have finished. They've all got their limits. But where I'm going with this is we can think about the creation of emotions as not just data inputs to the brain, but thinking about mixing up different ingredients is really useful. And here are some key ingredients, excuse me, that could be mixed up to create an emotion. So of course, we've got our body sensations, or our bottom-up physiology. We've got outside in, the people and places. And then we've got top-down memories, or things that we have learned in the past, books we've read, movies we've watched, what we've learned from our families, these experiences. And a really, really big part of this, a key ingredient in the construction of an emotion, is the words that we use to describe that emotion. So I'm even going to draw a pink circle around that to highlight that, because this is often not as well recognised, but is one of the key ingredients. The words that we've learned to describe how we feel in a particular situation help us make meaning of that situation. They are part of the construction of an emotion itself. So I'll just leave you to sit with that, this idea that emotion words are key ingredients in the construction of an emotion. So the next step from just having words to describe emotions is this concept of emotional granularity. Now, emotional granularity really is the ability to put feelings into words with a real high degree of specificity and precision. And so you may have come across one of these emotion wheels before. If you haven't, there is so many of them online. You can just put emotion wheel or emotional granularity wheel or a search like that into Google Images. And there's so many different ones that you may be able to download or use or create of your own based on the people that you work with. But the idea of granularity, and this is where I miss being on stages, because you can kind of move around on the stage and be a bit more theatrical. But people say, what does granularity mean? We can think of some emotion words like being like great big rocks, like the big basic emotions like anger or disgust or sadness. And then we can kind of chip away at those rocks and kind of finally, grind them down a little bit. So instead of like a big rock of a word, we have lots of finely grained, like little sandy words. And we can see the big rock words in the middle of the wheel here, and then we can kind of zoom out or move out towards the rim. We can start to see the more finely grained little sandy words. And the thing is about people is that we all differ in our ability, perhaps our knowledge, perhaps what we have learned, or just this may have never occurred to people before, that people differ in their ability to be able to describe and to use words to describe certain emotions. So at the center of the wheel sit some people, there's kind of, a spectrum of this, but little children essentially sit right in the middle of that circle there. They have the big rock words, and they often kind of muddle them up and use them interchangeably. So they might use sad and mad and angry all in one go. They haven't really yet developed these adult-like concepts and a broad enough vocabulary to be able to describe these words. And of course, then we have people like right out of the edge here who are kind of like emotional experts in a way. And they are able to use words to help construct meaning and create emotional experiences that are really finely tailored to fit each specific situation. So if you haven't come across one of these emotional wheels before, I've just zoomed in on it here. So we can see here angry is one word, but of course we have a whole lot of different words which kind of fall under this umbrella of anger, all of which are slightly different. So jealousy is very different from hostility, is very different from skepticism, is very different from being dismissive or feeling resentful. And zoomed in on the happy. And really interesting when you start looking at the psychology of emotions. The good ones never get as many, they never kind of take up as big a piece of the pie as the negative ones. But we've got kind of like, I'm good, I'm happy. My teenage son, he's just turned 13, he has 2 emotion words. They are huh and huh. Huh. And we're trying to encourage him to broaden his emotional vocabulary beyond these 2, which we think kind of mean good and kind of mean bad. But there is actually a really interesting developmental trajectory in terms of how children learn to recognize and describe these. There's actually a U-shaped trajectory of development of the understanding of emotional granularity and being able to use them. And interestingly, his and is kind of developmentally normal. He's kind of right at the bottom of that trough. And there's nothing that annoys him more, and like nothing I love saying to him more these days than, oh, darling, you're so developmentally normal, when he, does things that all 13-year-old boys do. So, if you're good, you've got, happy and content and thrilled and relaxed and joyful. And if you've got, I often talk about 50 shades of blue. People want to talk about depression as if it's one thing. And I say, well, there's 50 shades of blue in there, from deep, treatment-resistant clinical depression all the way through to feeling, just perhaps a bit, kind of numb or whatever. We've got angry and alarmed and grumpy and remorseful and gloomy and uneasy and resentful and afraid, and we could kind of go on and on and on. I've got lots of examples kind of written down here. So really the main idea is that having fine-grained emotion words, these little sandy fine-grained emotion words to name emotions matters, because let's go back to the prediction brain. The brain needs to figure out what all the data means, make some meaning of that, and then figure out what to do next. So words help make meaning of an experience, and this is deeply influential on what we choose to do next. So if we expand our emotional vocabulary, it's a bit like kind of having, this mental well-being thesaurus or something. You've got more insight, you've got more agency, you've got, more meaning to be made about any particular experience. And of course, then that opens up a much broader range of responses. So you might think about how you would feel if you felt harassed. You come home from work and you're angry, or you're irritated, and you feel harassed. Now, that is going to be very different than if you feel betrayed. So perhaps you feel harassed by your boss versus feeling betrayed by your boss. So those are actually two quite different descriptions or meaning to be made. And so perhaps the decision on what to do next is going to be quite different, and certainly far more open and giving you more options than if you just had bad or sad or grumpy. So, you know, how might you respond if you were feeling an emotion like shame versus feeling an emotion like guilt versus feeling an emotion like regret? And Brené Brown has a great TED talk on this, and most people are very familiar with her work. But as she defines it, shame says I am bad, guilt says I did something bad, whereas regret says I could have done something differently. So having regret versus shame or guilt opens up the future in a way that, you know, shame or guilt don't. So what does all this mean for our kids? Well, instead of, you know, angry and grumpy and feeling sad, you know, they've got this broad range, this broad emotional landscape, which we can help as adults create for them. Remembering their brains don't contain a pre-packaged, hardwired little lizard repository of emotions that they're born with, and that's it. Emotions are concepts that they learn as they grow up. And they are learning, just as we can too, the appropriate vocabulary to describe how they feel. And we see this trajectory of development and this ability to be able to describe and discriminate amongst these emotions as we get older. So little kids' emotion categories are actually quite broad. They're like these big rocks, and they're really just kind of valence-based. So they're either good or they're bad. There's really not a lot of other granularity behind that. When they're kind of about age 3, that's where they're at. They know happy and they know sad. It's not until they get older that things become kind of gradually more multidimensional. And as I said, there is a really interesting trajectory. It just doesn't kind of get better and better and better and better and better as they get older. Kids start off with happy and sad, and then that kind of gradually expands to include more words. But it's still, the emotions are either good or their emotions are either bad. And as they start entering their teenage years, it starts opening up a whole lot more, whereby they've got the bad and the sad, but they can understand perhaps 2 emotions can coexist at the same time, or 3 emotions can coexist at the same time, and maybe they're in conflict. And what causes that kind of, you know, the kids start off and they get better and better, and then they kind of go through a phase in their early teenage years where they're not so good at that, and we're not entirely sure what the cause of that is, but then they shoot off and start to improve as they go through their teenage years into adulthood. That and I can't even quite mimic my son properly. It's actually, as I said, developmentally normal and entirely predictable, but it may be that there is these shifts in their physiology, their complex world, the shift from focusing on family as the main source of social connection to their friends. So there's a whole lot more complicated data streams coming in. There's a lot more ingredients into the mix, and they are starting to gain a new awareness of the changes in the physiological signals from their body. So as they kind of go through perhaps this shift, they are going through a period of time when they're struggling to find the right words. We need to be supplying them with all of these new words, because remember, words help you to construct the emotional experience and to make meaning of it. We know that if we look to teenagers do have better or stronger emotional granularity. They're much better at being able to solve problems, because what does an emotion do? It gives you information, it helps you make meaning, and it helps you decide what to do next. So this is especially the case in like kind of uncomfortable or negative or conflict emotions with teenagers. And I don't want to get into all of the research out there, but there is quite a substantial amount of research that shows this ability to be able to use this fine-grained, sandy language, particularly in teenagers, is associated with so many positive outcomes. And this has been done and studied both in longitudinal studies of childhood development, but also comparisons of let's go in and teach them this skill, and what do we see as an outcome? So we see fewer behavioural problems, they do better at school, they're more empathic and supportive of others, have better coping skills, more positive self-image, they have more positive and stable relationships with others. And there is some striking correlations in there between emotional granularity and mental health, resilience against mental health, and being able to kind of drag yourself back up out of, you know, a little shade of blue that you may find yourself in. And interestingly, many of the psychological prescriptions or tools that young people or anyone really may be taught, if perhaps you're getting some type of therapy for depression, etc., whatnot, and I'm sure many of you would already know this, is this, you know, we can train people in emotional granularity, because learning to name emotions, learning to broaden your emotional, you know, landscape is a skill that you can improve on. And so it's quite a good thing that we don't have these little lizardy hardwired emotions, because if we were stuck with the reptilian brain controlling everything, we'd really... And even in adulthood, we can learn as many new words, because learning new emotional words and this ability to be able to draw on them to make meaning of our emotional experiences isn't limited to childhood. And if anyone I don't know if anyone's come across this research or not before, but it comes from a researcher, a chap called Tim Lomas, who's at the University of East London. He's taken on this idea of learning new words in adulthood to describe emotions that were otherwise undescribed in the English language. So he draws on all of these words from outside of English that can be used to describe emotional experiences that we have. So we're all pretty familiar nowadays with the word Schadenfreude, which is that kind of little feeling of pleasure you have when someone you don't like very much screws up. And when we learn a new word like that, then we kind of often go, oh yeah, I know that feeling. And then we can use that to describe that feeling in the future. So Schadenfreude is not some hardwired emotion that only German speakers use when someone screws up. It's an experience that we can all learn to have. And I've been using this Dutch word that I was taught years ago, melig. And I've got a few Dutch friends, and years ago when I was in my early 20s, I was spending some time with them in the Netherlands. And I remember me and my friend Debbie were just having one of those, it was kind of late afternoon, and we were a bit tired, and we were silly, and we were giggling, and we were laughing at everything. Anything either one of us said just was so funny and silly. And her partner was saying, oh, this word melig, which means kind of like flowery, which really just describes that kind of lovely sleepy state when you just find everything silly and funny. And I've always remembered that word. And so I was really thrilled when I came across this work by Tim Lomas, which is such a really great way for us to expand our emotional vocabulary beyond these very, I sometimes feel these emotion words are a bit serious, and they kind of lose a little bit of fun and a little bit of joy in there. So I've just got some of my favorites here to show you, and I'm not going to try and pronounce the name which is up at the top, or the word up at the top, because I don't want to do each of these natural languages an injustice. But this word here is a Czech word which means to smother or crush by cuddling or fondling, to shower someone with boundless love, which is that feeling you get when someone's so cute, like your dog, or you always want to squeeze them because they're just so lovely. And I totally understand that feeling. I don't know whether any of you do. This other Hungarian word, which I think it's like an existential sort of early 20s or late teenage feeling, that sense that something undefined or unidentified is lacking or missing. And this word always makes me cry. Literally means that goodbye happiness, the joy of meeting someone you haven't seen in a long time. And every time I read this, I get tears in my eyes, because here I go again. I think, oh gosh, I'm going to have that emotion when I go back to New Zealand to see my mum in July, who I haven't seen for 2 years. Hooray for bubbles. But I know so many people, so many of us have gained perhaps a profound understanding of this word in the last year or so. It makes me weepy. I have to move on. This new word here, that I just have this particular memory in my youth, being at a youth camp, sort of having this feeling, sitting together in the darkness, perhaps expectantly waiting for something to happen or burst forth, that strange quiet before a momentous event. And I have quite a strong memory and feeling associated with that. And then crack. My husband's Irish, so that's another one of these words like Schadenfreude. is such a great description of a non-English word that's gained more common usage. And again, I remember the crack a few years ago when we were over in Dublin and we were catching up with my husband's old schoolmates. We just had an absolute belter of a night. I'm still a bit hungover from it about 5 years later, but that word summarises the feelings of that night, which is pretty cool because it was in Dublin. So I really, really encourage you to go and take a look at this website and play around with it. It's really, really fun and it's set up quite well. And so following on from the work of Tim Lomas, there's another chap, and he's got a great TED talk that you can go and listen to if you haven't yet, John Koenig, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Now, he set out not so much to draw on the words of other languages, but to kind of make up his own English-sounding words that express these inarticulated feelings. So he coined this word sonder, which now has taken off and it has started to be used quite widely. And he says it's just that kind of idea that realization you have when you understand that other people have an inner life as vivid and as complex as your own. Other people have epic stories that surround them, and actually you're just kind of a bit part player in their lives. And I again remember the exact moment I had that realization, and it was many, many years ago now when I was in my PhD, kind of early stages of the internet, and people started writing online blogs. And the first time I started reading people's online blogs, I was like, oh, other people have a life, an inner life as vivid and complex as my own. That was my moment of sonder. And I'm now busy trying to find a word to describe. Maybe someone has this word, they have access to other languages or have an idea. It's this particular feeling I get in autumn mornings, so this time of the year, on really sunny, crisp autumn mornings. And it makes me remember similar mornings when my boys were really, really little in those early preschool years. But in those mornings, I used to remember those autumnal mornings from when I was little. So it's some kind of sort of nostalgia for my childhood and my children's childhood, but at the same time, this kind of autumnal recognition of the cycle of life. I don't know, I'm hoping there's a word out there somewhere for that. So I just wanted to share that fantastic website. You'll spend hours on it. It's a lot of fun and it will teach you a lot. Might even bring some tears to your eyes as well, like it always does to mine. So just to sort of share some other tools with you in the last 5 minutes that I have of this talk. Obviously, we're really interested here in growing young minds and remembering that we are the providers of the wiring instructions of the young minds that we're growing around us. And, you know, if we can help little people choose, you know, to describe their emotional experiences, we're giving them so much agency and we're giving them so much resilience, and we're opening up the future to them in terms of what they can choose to do. So if you haven't come across the emotion wheel, or perhaps you use the emotion wheel, it might be really interesting to sort of see, you know, how that is proving useful with your little people. But of course, we're not stuck with something like an emotion wheel. We've got emojis nowadays, and like lots of different operating systems have different emojis. There's the Ross perplexed looking emoji in here. I quite often I always think about it as the Ross perplexed emoji on my phone, and the emoji's kind of going, like this. I don't even know if it's in this one here. But again, I mean, we may not necessarily need a word, we just need to make meaning or to have some kind of concept that we can use. And, you know, emojis might be a really fun thing to do with children. They may appreciate that more than an emotion wheel. There's a really fantastic app that you can download onto your phone if you haven't come across it, called the Mood Meter app. And I think it costs about $1.50, which is really nothing when you're thinking about investing in your children's emotional landscape. So I've just done some screen grabs if you haven't come across that before, so you can sort of see how it works. So you go in, and remember how I said children, especially when they're young, kind of have happy or sad, they have valence. They've got good and they've got bad. They haven't really tuned in yet to this idea about sort of arousal. As I said, I do not like to use the words fight or flight, but this phrase of arousal. So you can have high arousal and feel unpleasant, but you can also have high arousal and feel positive. So again, they've kind of expanded beyond just this kind of positive negative. And you can go in, you can kind of scan around the blue screen, and perhaps you might feel disheartened, and you can kind of see some other emotions around it which are related. Chill is kind of related to thoughtful and relaxed and restful, but again, slightly different. And then the really cool thing is, once you've gone here, I feel chill. So look on the bottom right here, it says next. You press on next, and then it prompts you to kind of make a little, like a diary entry. Going, well, what is the cause? Perhaps, are you at home, are you at work? What's going on? Can you kind of identify one of the causes? And so you write some little notes down, particularly useful as well for the positive emotions. If you're feeling in a state that's great, that you're enjoying, that's good, what got you here? Because that's going to give you some information and help you build the memories, so that next time you're in that state, you can go, oh, last time I was here, my body felt like this in this situation. I felt really blissful. And so again, you're helping to build that emotion in. And then so you can write your little diary entry, and then you can go, well, do I want to stay in this state, or do I want to shift? I chose irritated here. I got my 11-year-old to do this the other night. And he had dinner and he was chilled and he was getting ready for bed, but he had a sore tummy. So he decided he was annoyed. And then he said he wanted to shift. He didn't want to feel like that anymore. And it said get some fresh air, which we all had a laugh about because it's about 9 at night. But he did know that state wouldn't last. So again, it gives you this kind of like just a little wee tip, what you can do perhaps if you want to move on from that. So my boys, well, my youngest, not the one, he's not really into this kind of thing, but my younger one, who has a great deal of empathy and is very deeply in tune with how he feels, he really appreciates and understands this tool. And then, of course, perhaps with older people, older teenagers, perhaps, or, depending on the cognitive capacity of the people you work with, you can go and play around with the positive lexicography. And this is what it looks like here. And I saw that someone has actually put the link in there in the chat. So thank you very much for that. And you can kind of go, and you can see on the left-hand side of this screen grab here, you've got the different types of relationships or states you could be in. On the right, we've got languages, and you can kind of scroll through and find out all these different experiences that perhaps you may be able to have in the future once you have the emotion word for them. And here is another idea. How about inventing your own emotion words? Find some holes in the language of emotion that's out there and try and fill them up. I said I'm like looking for this sort of word about autumn and this kind of cycle of life and these lovely memories. We don't need to make this serious. It doesn't need to always be about mental health. Lots of families have lots of really funny words that are just understood by them, and that's okay. It doesn't matter if the word is completely made up. Emotions are really our reactions to the world, and we're not these passive receivers of the sensory input with these hardwired emotions. We're active constructors of these emotions. We're not at the mercy of these lizardy emotion circuits. We can really be an architect to build our own and other children's emotions. We haven't got these 6 basic emotions. We're more than our resting bitch face. We're not snobby and dismissive. Lots of us have incredibly rich emotional lives. So I encourage you to really be the architects of your own emotional experiences, and the words that you may even create are incredible gifts that you can give to the children that you work with. So I want to finish up now. I believe I've kind of had my time, and just to share if you want to go and find more about me, more from me, as I said, there was the I'll just pop it in the type. You can go and find my website there. So thank you very much for listening and for indulging me, because it says here I explain the brain, and that is like this is my happy place, talking about the brain, neuroscience. We've been doing it for a very long time. Plan to carry on doing it for much longer. And thank you so much for indulging my love of doing what I do on a Friday afternoon.